Okay, I'll just give like a minute for everyone to kind of join. Okay, so I might start now and people can join as we continue the session. So Mohammed, if you could help me interpret the introduction,
sure, no problem.
that'd be great. So good evening, everyone, and welcome to the information session on the humanitarian visa pathways for the Afghan community.
بعد از ظهر خوش برامتان میخوام خوش آمدید به جلسه معلوماتی بخاطر ویزای بشردوستانه برای کمیونیتی افغان ها.
My name is Sanishki and I'm a registered migration agent at AIMS Australia.
دیگه نام میگه سنشکی است. من یکی از بسا وکیلای مربوط کارهای مهاجرتی هستم در ایمز.
For those who might not know about AIMS, we are a Victorian government statutory authority that provides a range of services including settlement, employment and education to refugees and newly arrived migrants.
کسایی که میگه با دفتر ایمز آشنایی ندارن، ایمز یک دفتر است که بسا دفتر دولتی است. وظیفه اینا کمک و برای کسایی که تازه وارد زندگی کشور در قسمت مسائل کار پیدا کردن، در قسمت جابجا شدن و در قسمت درس.
Okay, and today we are joined by Karen Anderson and Samati Verma from Claudia Anderson Immigration Lawyers, who will be taking us through the visa options and pathways for those who have families in Afghanistan or outside of Afghanistan.
دیگه امروز که هست میگه ما دو وکیل با خود داریم، خانم کرن و خانم سمتی که اینا از خدمات مهاجرتی. Sorry, what is their firm's name? Sorry, didn't get.
Sorry,
Karen's firm name.
Karen Anderson.
Yeah, Karen Anderson. Samati. What's their company name? Sorry.
Claudia Anderson Immigration.
از دفتر کلودی اندرسون هستن که براتون معلومات درباره ویزای بشردوستانه.
Okay, and they are both experts in this field and they're both accredited specialists.
هر دو نفر میگه تخصص دارن و هر دو نفر به حساب درس خوانن در این قسمت.
Yeah, and we're really grateful for their time and expertise today.
دیگه ما بسیار قدردانی میکنیم میگه از دانششان و همچنین از وقتشان امروز.
Okay, so before we begin, I'd like to start with the acknowledgement of traditional owners.
بیسیک شروع کنم میخوام قدردانی کنم شناسایی کنم از باشنده‌های اصلی سرزمین.
On behalf of AIMS Australia, we would like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of this land on which we are meeting today.
ما از طرف دفتر ایمز ما میخوایم به حساب شناسایی کنیم، قدردانی کنیم و از باشنده یا صاحبای اصلی سرزمین.
We pay respects to their elders past, present and recognize their continuing connection to country, land, waters, sky and cultures past and future.
و همچنان یک از نامه است که من در اول میخوانم و ما خیلی حساب قدردانی کنیم از اینا که So could you repeat the last bit? Sorry.
Yeah, we pay respects to their elders past and present.
ما میخوایم به حساب احترام کنیم بر تمام بزرگان از اینا در گذشته و در آره.
And recognize their continuing connection to country, land, waters, sky and cultures past and future.
و همچنین میتونیم به حساب قدردانی کنیم که ارتباط مستقیم از اینا با آب و زمین و هوا و آسمان و گذشته و حالشون.
We also acknowledge and pay respects to Indigenous and Torres Strait Islanders that are in attendance today.
و همچنین میگه برای کسایی که اینجا امروز حاضر نیستن، کسایی که از مردمای بومی استرالیا هستن یا جزایر تورس هستن و از نام ما قدردانی میکنیم.
So before I hand over to Samati and Karen, I would just like to go through a few points. The information session today will be delivered in English, but we will get the assistance of the interpreter during the Q&A session.
قبل از اینکه میگه بسا رشته سخنه بتون برای خانم سامنتی و کرن میخوایم که یادآور شم که جلسه معلوماتی امروز در زبان انگلیسی می باشه و در اخیر جلسه سوالا که جوابایی که شما دارین باز وقت میتونین که از ترجمان استفاده کنین برای سوال پرسان کردن و جواب گرفتنش.
And in the chat, we will also share a recording of the information session carried out by the Springwell Monash Legal Service with the assistance of a Dari interpreter for those who might want to access that information.
و همچنین این معلومات هم که هست میگه از دفتر دیگه هم میگه میباشه، ترجمان زبان دری هم میباشه که به نام was Monash Legal Services, yeah?
Yeah.
از طریق Monash Legal Services.
And please continue to put your questions in the chat. It can be in English or in Dari or Hazaragi.
در قسمت میگه چت کرد، در قسمتی که میتونید پیغاماتون یا با زبان دری یا هزارگی انگلیسی بنویسین و سوال پرسان کنید.
Myself and my colleague Saeed, who's joining us today, will go through and select some of the frequently asked questions.
دیگه ما و همکارم آقای سعید باز بعض از این سوالا رو به حساب انتخاب میکنیم باز و کوشش میکنیم جواب براش بدیم.
And this is a general information session, so we are unable to address any specific questions relating to any individual circumstances.
البته
Sorry.
جلسه امروز که هست میگه فقط شکل معلومات عمومی را داره و لطفاً میگه سوالایی که خاص مربوط پرونده یا کیس شما میشه پرسان نکنید، فقط معلومات عمومی است.
Okay, great. I will hand over to Karen and Samati to do the presentation.
دیگه نال خانم کارن سامنتی شروع میکنم و در زبان انگلیسی میباشم.
Thank you, Mohammed.
Thank you.
Thank you. Welcome everyone. I'll share my screen and just go through some PowerPoint slides, which will be available at the end of the session. And we'll try and get through it fairly quickly to leave enough time for questions. So I'll just put you onto, can you see that? Sorry, I'm just making sure I'm on the right, there we go. Can everyone see that now? Is that working?
Yeah.
The front page? All right, so we're going to look at some humanitarian visa options for Afghan citizens in country and out of country. And just move to the next, there we go. We'll look at what is the current commitment to Afghan nationals, the way the refugee and humanitarian visa application process works, the role of the Australian proposer, the order of priority for the applications, the forms themselves, the evidence and the process for lodgement. And then Sen Marty will talk about some of the more complex issues that may or may not arise. So I'll just deal with some of the very basics. In terms of the current commitment, it is very limited at the moment. There are a lot of people advocating for change to that. The Australian government announced only 3,000 humanitarian places specifically for Afghan nationals, and that would be part of the cap or quota of 13,750 in total, not on top of that. Obviously, there are unfortunately many more Afghan nationals who need a humanitarian visa than that number. For that reason, it is useful, and I won't be dealing with other visas, but if anyone does have skilled options or family visa options, it is important that they get that advice rather than just instinctively think about this visa category. Because of the caps, there are very limited numbers of visas available, and if there's another option, it's definitely worth exploring. With regard to the humanitarian visa process, it is a very lengthy one, even in circumstances where the situation of the visa applicants is extreme. It simply does take a lot of time for these to be processed, even in the context of a humanitarian crisis like what is happening in Afghanistan. As I mentioned, there are a lot of experts and commentators arguing for a significant increase in the number of offshore humanitarian visas for anywhere up to 20,000. And there's a session that Refugee Legal is putting on this week that will talk about some of the things that commentators and advocates are urging the government to do to assist Afghans more. You can also speak to your local member of parliament, and they can address your particular situation, migration situation. They do have employees who are familiar with the migration process. Julian Hill's office in Dandenong has been particularly helpful advocating for his constituents there. But obviously their capacity is limited and they can't be helping people fill out forms. There's also a special page on the department's website that deals with updates specifically in relation to the Afghanistan situation. In the weeks leading up to the 31st of August and the withdrawal of troops, there were daily updates and warnings and a lot of information. There are still things happening, still changes being made in terms of how applications are to be lodged and clarifications of where to lodge them. And some of that information you will find on the department's website at that update. So have a look at that from time to time. There are 5 different types of offshore refugee and humanitarian class XB visas. So there's in immigration what we call an alphabetical class. These visas are called a class XB. And there's the 200 refugee visa, the 201 in-country special humanitarian, 202 global special humanitarian, 203 emergency rescue, and 204 women at risk. And I'll deal with each one briefly. The important thing to note is that each of those subclasses is part of one overall class. So the same forms that you fill out will constitute an application for each of those visas. You don't need to pick one. If there's an Australian proposer available, an official one through the migration regulations, they must be either a citizen, a permanent resident, or an eligible New Zealand citizen, which is a New Zealand citizen who's been in Australia since 2001. Unfortunately, a proposer cannot be a person holding a CHEV or a TPV, a temporary protection visa 790 or 785. Those people cannot propose an application, offshore application, or a bridging visa holder. The Australian proposer does take on financial responsibilities. They are limited to the cost of travel and arranging initial accommodation. So it's not a specific monetary cost and it's not for an extended period of time. There's also the obligation to meet the applicant and assist them in a practical sense. There are different priority groups that the government has established over many years in the processing of these applications. There are 5 broad categories. There's no additional fees that can be requested to get a faster process. How to get your case seen above others is really not something that we can advise on. And I'll come to the process by which individual cases are assessed in a moment. The main priority are what are known as the split family applications. So that's immediate family members. That's the nuclear family, husbands, wives, and children. Of someone in Australia who themselves was granted one of those 200 visa applications, a Class XB visa or a 866 onshore permanent protection visa in the last 5 years. So essentially family reunion. So that's a limited category and it's only for permanent visa holders, as I said at the start. So if someone comes without their immediate family on an offshore humanitarian visa, they are allowed to bring in their immediate family within the first 5 years, provided that relationship was declared in their application. Also, applicants proposed by a relative who lives in a regional location, but again, a permanent visa holder. Can or would be considered priority 1. So that could be a broader range of relatives. permanent visa holder, as I said, and not necessarily a protection visa holder. The second priority is a close family member who doesn't hold perhaps a protection visa or 851, but is a permanent resident. So they don't meet necessarily the split family definition. They're not achieving family reunion through a refugee process, but they are close family. Priority 3 is an extended family member who, again, doesn't necessarily hold a protection visa. That would be priority 1. And is in a more extended range of family relationship, so cousins, grandparents, grandchildren. I emphasize this is just the order of priority, and it depends entirely on the quota, how many applications are received. And already, as we know, there are many more applications than there are places. Priority 4 is a proposal by a friend or distant relative who themselves is not a protection visa holder. And priority 5 is an applicant proposed by a person who holds a protection visa application, and if they are a citizen, then the application would then become a priority 1, 2, 3, or 4, depending on the closeness of the relationship. The initial application form 842 is, as I said, an application for all of the different visa categories within that class, so 200, 201, 202, 203, and 204. It is completed by the family head or the main applicant, so an adult, and then all the family relationships follow from the identification of that individual. And those people included in the application must meet the definition of member of the family unit. So that's a defined group of people. And it's important to lodge separate applications for different family units. When the application is made, as I said, you're considered for each of the different 5 visa subclasses. You don't therefore need to nominate which visa subclass. And if your circumstances change, so if you move from being in country to being out of your country of nationality, you don't need to relodge the application. It's still considered, but considered under a different subclass, depending on physically where you are and your circumstances. And I'll come to the criteria for each of the different subclasses in a minute. So as I said, secondary visa applicants must be a member of the family unit. That includes their spouse or de facto, so married or de facto partner living together as if married. It could include a dependent child or dependent stepchild, but not nephews and nieces. It can include a dependent single adult relative, so a mother, for example, who is single. So they must be, and who lives in the same household as the main applicant. So they would need to be unmarried or widowed, and need to be dependent on the main applicant, as well as living with them. So there are restrictions on family of the unit that come from the blood relationship and the relationship of marriage, and also the physical residence, who lives in that household, and are they an adult dependent relative, for example, a parent of the main applicant. To make a valid application, there must be a residential address noted in the application form. So This can be tricky. Generally, addresses are sufficiently defined in Afghanistan that you can give an address. I have had with some sort of African cases an address which is really quite descriptive. You know, third house on the left down a particular street, where, you know, areas and streets are not named and houses are not numbered, but wherever possible, a specific address with the name of the street and the number of the residents is the easiest way and the best way to describe a residential address. The department does maintain confidentiality of all of this information, including the claims. So anything that is submitted to the department is kept private. If a family group changes, so the family constellation changes, or their place of residence changes, they must tell immigration of the change. So certain obligations arise in terms of advising the department where an answer to any of the questions in the application form 842 change in a substantial way. So, for example, place of residence and the constellation of the family unit. You can also add information at any time. So when an application is pending, you can add further evidence. You don't have to provide everything at the outset. The form 681 is the proposal form completed by the Australian permanent resident or citizen, and they sign that and complete it and agree to those responsibilities. The documents that are essential are identity documents, and those documents must be genuinely issued. And if it's not certain that they are genuinely issued, it's important to not provide them. Provide as much identity information as you can and as accurate information as you can. So family records, ideally passports or tazkeras issued in an official capacity pre-Taliban. The statement of claims can be, as I said, added to, but the core reasons why the visa applicant fears harm and the type of harm that they fear should be explained. So that would essentially be a history of that person's life, description of their perhaps religion, their ethnicity, their work, the various factors that they think give rise to fear of harm and a real risk of that harm occurring. There could be evidence that might be supportive if it relates to a person's employment for an NGO or foreign government, then evidence of that employment. It could be photographs, it could be pay records, it could be identity cards or employer cards. That should say public profile. There might also be an applicant who was a journalist or who was a lawyer or who had certain skills or was outspoken in some way. Evidence of that should be provided. Where relevant, evidence of the person's links to Australia should be included, and there are questions about that. Something from the Australian proposer explaining the support that they will provide can be provided, as well as financial evidence from the Australian proposer showing that they can support the applicant, and evidence of UNHCR registration if it is possible to obtain that. UNHCR has traditionally played a very pivotal role, and UNHCR registration is very useful, but obviously only if it's safe and possible to obtain that. Can that be provided? Now, the 842 and 681 are relevant where there is an Australian proposer, and the proposer should be Australian. And I mention this because there are very technical rules around how to make a valid application. Where there is an Australian proposer, the application is to be sent to this address in Sydney by post, tracked so that you know it's received, and keep a photocopy, or by courier or online. So there is the possibility of an online lodgement where there is a proposer, an Australian proposer, as well as consideration of the application in Australia in Sydney. Unfortunately, the way the migration regulations have been established, where there is no proposer, the application to be valid needs to be sent by post or courier to a diplomatic, consular or migration office outside Australia. And so in the previous weeks, we have been struggling to post applications to an embassy or high commission outside Australia who will process it, which is functioning, or who will pass it on. And we've had a great lack of clarity from the department about where they want these sent. And there are problems with post and delivery and receipting in a number of overseas posts because of the pandemic. The government is looking into this, and we are also getting clarification of whether we can lodge through Sydney or the online portal, where we have someone fill out the 681. So we have a form 681, but they're not Australian. So we have the form completed. We meet technically the requirements, the validity requirements, as a way to provide a greater level of certainty and clarity about where the application has gone, who is dealing with it, and getting you a file number and trying to get that back to you as quickly as possible so that you know it's been received, you know that it's being dealt with. The department has advised some practitioners that where an applicant is living in Afghanistan and they do not have a proposer, so there's no form 681 at all, then it must be a paper form. And the particular embassy they want it sent to is Jordan. So this wasn't clear until a short time ago. We now know that Jordan is the place that these physical applications are to be posted to. But obviously, acknowledgements of the receipt of those applications is taking time. But at this stage, that may be the safest way to lodge the application and get proof that it's gone there, and then hopefully get a written acknowledgement from that post. That's the one that immigration is saying is the one to send it to. The web form, the online portal, immigration is saying is available, as I said, only where there is a form 681. And we're hoping that, and this is getting a bit technical, that we will get confirmation soon from the department that lodging an in-country 201, so for Afghan citizens who are living within Afghanistan, and who have a proposer who is not an Australian relative, proposer who's an Australian permanent resident or citizen who is either under the split family or one of those provisions, can still be lodged electronically simply by virtue of the fact that there is a Form 681 completed by a community member. It's not a legal requirement for the 201 visa. And in fact, the only proposers that are relevant to those visa applications are members of the family who are permanent residents. So that should be clarified soon. In the meantime, excuse me, probably it would be advisable to post the application to Jordan. Excuse me. I also wanted to briefly talk about the community support program. Excuse me. Oh, maybe I'll do that after San Marty speaks. And we can come back to that. Oh, excuse me.
Okay, so just bear with me a second. Let me try and share the screen. Hello, everybody. My name's Sanmati. I also work at Clothier Anderson. Just bear with me 1 second. Okay. All right. Can everybody see my screen? Can everyone give me an indication? Okay. All right. Hi, everybody. My name is Sanmati. I'm a lawyer at Clothier Anderson as well. I'm going to talk you through, this is the more difficult part of it's the more depressing part of the evening. I'm going to talk a little bit about the risks associated with these applications. I don't at all mean to be dispiriting. I don't at all mean to discourage anybody from preparing and lodging these applications. But hopefully what you would have gleaned from what Karen has just said is that a couple of things. One, that the numbers are very few that the government has permitted for humanitarian visas for this program year. So there is an allowance of 3,000 specifically dedicated to Afghan nationals, which is itself an extraordinarily small amount within an extraordinarily small program, which is only around 13,700 places. So that there are limited spots. And hopefully the second message that you've taken away is that if people have, or if your family members, your friends who are in Afghanistan are skilled, they have family members in Australia, they might have any other options available to them, it is worth exploring those options. So hopefully you've taken these two takeaway points. So with that in mind, look, I've left this slide in here from an earlier presentation that I gave. So this is just a little bit of guidance to people for the avenues to pursue to chase up your application once it's actually lodged. This information was good a couple of weeks ago. This information is changing all the time. Doesn't cost you anything to email these email addresses and follow up. I'm not entirely sure whether they're responsive anymore. They were very helpful up until the 31st of August. As you can see here, the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade were coordinating humanitarian visa applications and also emergency evacuations directly outside of Afghanistan. Obviously, after the 31st of August, international forces aren't in charge of, Hamid Karzai International Airport anymore. What role the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade plays anymore in Kabul is completely unclear. The worst that can happen is that you send an email to one of these addresses and you get an auto reply. It's still worthwhile, I think. They're updating their auto responses all the time. So if you've lodged an application, I think it is a good idea to at least email one or all of these addresses just with a copy of the application and to ask for next steps, especially for applicants who are still in Afghanistan. As I said, the worst that you can get is an auto reply saying that the Department of Home Affairs is now responsible for these applications and I can't give you any more information. So that was just that little bit of information. Sorry that this is so text heavy. When I look at it now, I regret it. So sorry for this very dense slide. Look, I wanted to talk a little bit about the risks associated with information that you put in to humanitarian visa applications. Of course, not just if you're making the application yourself, but if you are making the application on behalf of family members or friends in Afghanistan, or if you're making the application on behalf of applicants in Afghanistan who have family members or connections here in Australia. What I would like everyone to keep in the forefront of their mind is what might happen to those family members or connections in Australia as a consequence of the information that is contained in this humanitarian visa application, where that particularly where that humanitarian visa application might have a low chance of success, not because people are not going through a terrible time, but simply because of the numbers that the government has allowed, right? In an ideal universe, when you are preparing and lodging a humanitarian visa application for somebody who has family members in Australia, you would have a copy of that family member's file. And on the forms that you're filling out and the previous forms that that family member provided, you would have them and you would sit them side by side, and the information would be absolutely identical in every way. I can see that somebody's raising their hand. We'll come to questions right at the end. Don't worry, we haven't forgotten you. The way to obtain family members' files is, I suppose there are a number of logical ways. The first is simply to ask them, ask those family members, ask whether you can have a copy of their application forms if they've retained them. The other way is to simply ask their migration agent or their lawyer for a copy of their files if they were assisted to lodge their own application. And the third is to apply to the department directly for release of those files under freedom of information. I appreciate that these applications are being lodged with a sense of extreme urgency. I also appreciate that the department can take months to release people's files under freedom of information. So I understand this is all an ideal universe, but that would be the ideal way to do it. To sit side by side the application form that you're filling out with every other application form that's been filled in by friends and associates of this person. When I mean associates, I mean, for example, an application I recently saw was a former colleague who worked with the United Nations, who was proposing a colleague of his who was in Kabul, and their employment history was shared. In an ideal universe, given their employment history was shared, you would see the proposer's application and what he said. So you wouldn't want a situation where the proposer is, sort of providing different information about their work history together and, what they did and the names of people involved in a way that would endanger the proposer themselves and their permanent visa, if that makes sense. So that's what I mean about consistency. So what can result from inconsistencies? Of course, the most obvious thing that can result from inconsistencies is the refusal of the application that you put in. That is, of course, a concerning thing, particularly if you're going to be waiting many, many years for this application to be processed, right? But even more seriously, say that the family members in Australia are not citizens, say that they are permanent visa holders, say that they are temporary visa holders, say that they are bridging visa holders. The result can be the cancellation of the visas held by those people. So I've got a little table down here that spells out the different powers that are available to the Department of Immigration. Visa cancellation, of course, is not automatic. You get notice, unless, of course, you're overseas, in which case there is a particular power under the Migration Act where you can have your visa cancelled without notice, particularly scary. You can just be sitting there one day and open your Gmail and receive a notice saying your visa's been cancelled. You have this amount of time to seek reinstatement. Very scary state of affairs. But other than that, when you're onshore and one of these powers is being used, the department will write to you first and give you notice. They don't give you a lot of notice, and it is a very panic-inspiring thing to receive a notice of intention to consider cancellation of your visa, right? It's a terrible thing. So if you're holding either a temporary or permanent visa is capable of cancellation under Section 109 on the basis that the holder has given incorrect information, they've failed to update their records with the Department of Home Affairs, or they've given bogus documents. So say that you've got a situation where you have a cousin who's in Kabul, but in order to, and you haven't declared them on your own application, and they are in fact not your brother, but in a panic to bring that person to Australia, which is understandable, you describe that person as a brother in your application, or in your proposal of them, you hold a permanent visa. Say the department looks at that, compares the two applications side by side. You haven't provided any identity documents, you weren't able to at the time that you applied for your own visa. They say, hang on a second, your family composition is not what you initially declared. We're going to issue you a notice of intention to consider cancellation of your visa. So this is a very, very cruel thing for immigration to do at the current juncture. And we just cannot know whether this is the type of thing that they will do, but be aware that if they want to, they have the power to do it, right? When it comes to a temporary visa, the powers are even broader. So not only does Section 109 apply in those circumstances, you've got Section 116, even broader range of powers. So you can have your temporary visa cancelled. So say we're talking about a SHEV, say that you're a community member and you're proposing family members of somebody who holds a SHEV, for instance, and say that you give information about their history or their past or their family composition that's different from what was in their SHEV, say for instance, then there are a whole range of powers that are available. So the department can cancel on the basis that the visa was granted based on facts and circumstances that didn't exist at the time, or on the basis that they're not satisfied of that person's identity any longer, that there's such a confusion between what's been put in the new application, the new humanitarian application, and what was said in that person's SHEV, that they're so disturbed and they have no idea who that SHEV holder is anymore. So again, these are very harsh realities. I don't say that the department is, 100% likely to act in this way. It's just that I'm sure everyone on the line will be aware that this particular government has not been hesitant to use the powers available to it under the Migration Act, and robustly and in ways that can be considered cruel. Okay, so that's risk number one. Risk number two. What can inconsistent information do for your to your application for Australian citizenship? So there are a range of reasons why people need their citizenship. Of course, to provide them with certainty, to mean that they are no longer the holder of a visa that can be subject to cancellation and so forth. But more importantly, because if you are a citizen, then so say your partner or your family member's visa applications are no longer subject to a low level of priority. They are given, say that you came by boat, and as a permanent visa holder, as a non-citizen, your wife has got an application where you are the sponsor. Because of a ministerial direction, it is subject to the lowest level of priority. You manage to escape that if you become a citizen. So that is a reason why, if you're a protection visa holder, you might want to transition to citizenship. If inconsistent information is given in the humanitarian visa application, that can put a spanner in the works of the citizenship application in a couple of ways. One, it can mean that the minister, through his delegates, is no longer satisfied of the applicant's identity for the purpose of the citizenship application. It's a requirement the minister must be, through his delegates, must be satisfied. And identity is a very weird and nebulous sort of concept. It doesn't just involve your documents, it involves how much your narrative or how much your story about the past hangs together, how your family composition hangs together across different sources of information. It's a very broad concept. Secondly, the second basis is if, say, the information is radically inconsistent, that there's parts of the information just doesn't marry together, then the application can be refused on an even more serious basis, on the basis that the minister is not satisfied that the applicant's of good character. So Karen and I have seen, you really wouldn't think this would be the type of basis for refusal of a citizenship application, just trying to get your family members to Australia, albeit under different identities. But the reality is they're, subject to persecution in their home country. You wouldn't think that this would be the type of basis for a refusal, but we've seen refusals on this basis for Afghan citizens, that they have just simply tried to bring people to Australia under false identities or different identities from their true identities. So it's not impossible this would happen. Anyway, the take-home point from all of this is just be careful. We are simply lawyers. These are not our risks to assume. We're not the ones who are in such a terrible situation. We don't mean to lecture you or browbeat you. We just mean for you to be careful and think about the consequences, because if your family members here are the anchor to ultimately be able to bring other people out to Australia, it is important that you do not get your visa cancelled. It is important that you remain an anchor, because it is only once you are here that you can think of sponsoring your family members over and providing a channel for them. So what are the take-home points? Actually, I might just see how Karen's going and whether her throat permits her to continue or whether I should wrap up.
Can everyone hear me again? I'll share my screen. I think it was this one, community support. Yes. Can everyone see that? I have taken across all. Yes. So the community support program, we can actually hear a bit more about from AIMS. AIMS is one of the approved proposing organisations. It's a program that does give applicants some priority. And that's why I mention it, because a lot of Afghans are highly educated. And to be eligible for this program, you need to be outside your home country. So it unfortunately does not apply to people in Afghanistan. But if you have relatives living outside Afghanistan and outside Australia who are or would be subject to substantial discrimination or persecution in Afghanistan, and who would meet the criteria for a 202 visa, and who are aged between 18 and 50 and have adequate English, which is assessed at an interview. So it's not an IELTS score of 5 or 4.5 or 6. It's more of a holistic sort of assessment of whether the person could get by, and has some skills or a job offer, a connection to Australia that is an assurance of work, then they might be screened in through an APO. And that would achieve some level of priority in respect of their application. The approved proposing organisations are the gatekeepers for this program. They do the initial screening. They provide any links if required to the employment. They help then lodge the visa application. You might have an Australian supporter who wants to provide you with work, or the overseas applicant with work. You can otherwise just make direct contact with an APO and say, look, these are the skills that I have or my relative has. And they also link people with Australian businesses, and they are given resettlement priority. It is expensive. There are additional fees. The initial screening process isn't expensive. I think it's $250 for most APOs. And then if screened in, then the larger fees are to be paid. The fee structure is set out at the department's, not at the department's webpage, but at each of the individual APO's pages. So if you go to this link, you'll see a description of how the a list of all the APOs, and also how the community support program might work. I think it's about $16,444 for a main applicant if you get all the way to a visa grant. And that is only if you pass through 3 previous stages of being screened in, preparing and lodging an application, and then being almost accepted by the department. So the department doesn't request those funds unless they're about to grant the visa. But there are fees associated with the first 3 steps as well that are not insignificant. And as I said, it's only for people who are out of country. But again, it's worth getting advice on this. I think AIMS has an expression of interest process that is only done once a year. And I understand it's November or December of this year.
That's right, yeah.
So, you know, that's coming up very quickly. And if you don't get in this November or December, it will be another year. So do have a look at the costs associated. And if your relatives or you fit that general description of being 18 to 25 and having some English, some skills, and some perhaps connections, or AIMS might assist in that regard. And if they can afford it, it might be worth pursuing this option. It's based on a Canadian scheme, and it's a process that may just lead to a greater prospect of a visa. As I said at the start, though, there might be other skilled visas as well that apply. You know, as I said, there's a lot of highly qualified Afghans with very good English, and it would be a shame if they didn't know all of the visas that were available. So if you do have relatives with qualifications and experience that you think might be suitable for skilled migration or employer-sponsored visas. Do get advice from one of the free legal services or a private lawyer. Most private lawyers charge a couple of $100 for at least an initial advice, just to make sure there's no other options you could be pursuing. There were some questions. I don't know how you want to deal with them if people want them answered in English, because they are in English. So
what we could do is we could use the interpreter for the Q&A session, just so that everyone can understand some of the most frequently asked questions. Yep. I think I'll ask the first one, and Saeed, if you've received any from the community, maybe you go next. So one of the questions, and this is something that we frequently get, is if an applicant or applicants don't have a Tazkera or a passport, what other alternative evidence can they provide to prove their identity?
Would you like to interpret that?
Yes, please.
یکی سوالایی است که گفتن که اگر مثلا درخواست دهنده مثلا کارت هویت یا مثلا شناسایی تذکره یا پاسپورت نداره، دیگر کدام مدارک میتونن به جای پیش کنن؟
Am I muted? No. There could be earlier visa applications in which they are named. So there could be sort of an immigration history through relatives that has been already established. There could be school records, education records, anything that is written. In some instances, so in the citizenship space, there is just a life history. So essentially a statement of your family constellation and where you were born and your life history.
کسایی که میگن مدرک شناسایی مثلا ندارن، تذکره یا پاسپورت، اونا مثلا میتونن که از طریق قضیه که کدام خویشاوند نزدیکشان آمده باشه استرالیا قبلا نامایشان دلست داده باشه، از روی میتونن مثلا شناسایی کنن قبلا نامشان لست داده شده بوده باشه، یا میتونن بعض مدارک که مثلا بعض مکتب گرفتن یا جایی که تحصیل کردن، مدارک تحصیلاتی خود میتونن پیشکش کنن به یک مدرک، و یکی که مثلا میتونن یک اظهارنامه رسمی نشر کنن یا استیتمنت درباره هویت خود، درباره شهروندی خود، مثلا من از کجا به دنیا آمدیم، از کجا هستم، میتونن چیز نشون میتونن.
Saeed, did you have any specific questions?
Yeah, a lot of people asked, it's probably not too much relevant to this in the first session, but a lot of people asked about SHAVE and TPV holders, whether if there's any move from the government, if there's any changes or policy talks, and if not, how can they sponsor their family?
خب یک سوال دیگه میگن که آمدن با وجودی که به یه چیز زیاد ارتباط ندارن، میگن که کسایی که دارنده ویزای مثلا موقتی شف و ویزای پرندگی تی پی وی هستن موقتی، آیا مثلا کدام حرکت کدام کار از طرف دولت استرالیا مثلا نشان داده شده که آیا کدام تغییر در حالت اینا بیارن یا نه؟
Yes, there is a push to have those visas converted or a process for permanent protection, but it hasn't happened yet.
فعلا میگه فشارهای زیاد سر دولت آورده شده کمی ویزای موقت که پناهنده دارن به ویزای دائمی تبدیل شده، منتها هنوز کدام عکس العمل از دولت نشان داده نشده.
Okay, I might go next.
Sorry, Tanushki, on that one, obviously they can't sponsor their family. Is there another way they can do it?
No, the family.
میگن کسایی که ویزای موقت دارن آیا میتونن از کدام طریق خانواده‌های خود مثلا اسپانسر شدن و بخواین در استرالیا؟
They can assist with forms, but they can't formally propose, and they're not strictly relevant other than the history and the identity issues that might assist to identify the applicants. So definitely they are part of the family and need to be disclosed, but they can't propose their family members.
میگه اونا میتونن که فرما را تکمیل خانه‌پوری کنن بفرستن، منتها مثلا باعث پیشنهادگر یا پروپوزال نمیتونن، اسپانسر نمیتونن باشن، فقط باید نشته کنن که کی است کشاندشن واسه واقعیت بگن، منتها کدام تفاوت خاص نمیره.
Can they use other family members who are citizen or permanent resident or family and friend to sponsor their family?
Yes, there could be. That's possible.
بله. میگه که آیا میتونن که از دیگه دوستا خویشاوندایی که در اینجا دارن که اونا ویزای میدن اونا استفاده کنن که خانوادهشون اسپانسر شه؟ وکیل میگن بله میتونن از طریق از نوعی کار انجام بدن.
Yeah, that's it. Thanks.
Okay. So I'm just going to combine two questions. Can you fill a Form 842 on behalf of somebody else? Does the form need to be signed? And for those in Afghanistan who can't post it because there are no postal services, can somebody else lodge on their behalf?
سوال دیگه کردن، میگه که فرم 842 رو میتونه نفر در اینجا از طرف نفر در افغانستان است تکمیل کنه، آیا امضا کار داره؟ و همچنان چون در افغانستان میگه خدمات پستی نیست، آیا میتونه نفر از اینجا تسلیم بده فرمشن؟
They do need to be signed and the information needs to be accurate. They don't need to post them.
Sorry, could you?
They do need to be signed and all the information needs to be accurate.
بله، میگه که باید امضا کنن فرم را شخص درخواست دهنده و باید معلوماتشون کاملا درست و صحت داشته باشه.
But they don't need to go to the post office. It is difficult not having access to a signature, but during COVID, electronic signatures have become the norm, and it is possible to affix an electronic signature to a form where we are satisfied, for example, as lawyers, the contents are true and correct, and that the person knows what it is they're signing and has checked it.
دیگه با وجودی که میگن نداشتن خدمات پستی مشکل است، بخاطر باید امضاش و پستش، منتها بخاطر از این مسائل دوران کرونایی زیاد جایا مثلا امضای برقی را به حساب باعث شکل نرمال قبول دارن، میتونن که به حساب امضای برقی بکنن، منتها به شرط ازی که وقتی پیشی که امضا میکنن تمام محتویات درخواست اونا فهمیده باشن و بفهمن که درست است و صحیح است.
Okay. Asay, did you have any other questions?
So yeah, question was, do you recommend to use a migration agent to lodge the application? If you do, where can they refer to where it's not too expensive?
سوال دیگه میکنه، میگه شما پیشنهاد میکنه که ما از همین اجنتای بخش مهاجرتی یا مایگریشن اجنت استفاده کنیم و اگر میگن که بکنین، آیا شما پیشنهاد میکنین بعض دفترهایی که مثلا زیاد گران، زیاد قیمت نباشه؟
The ASRC has a clinic that is now operational, and they have a large volume of volunteers helping with the forms.
So did you say ARC?
The Asylum Seeker Resource Center. Yeah.
دیگه Asylum Seeker Resource Center برای یکی از دفترهای به حساب خدمات مهاجرین هست که اونا در اواخر مثلا امکانات زیاد دارن، اونا میتونن شما را کمک کنن که تکمیل کنین فرمایتان.
They are asking that the forms be pre-prepared and the evidence of identity be gathered before the appointment with the lawyer, which usually runs for 3 hours.
منتها اونا همیش میگن که لطفاً فرما را شما پیش از پیش معلوماتاش تکمیل بکنین و مدارک هویتیشون هم با امراش داشته باشین. باز روز برای شما یک جلسه 3 ساعته درست میکنن و تمامش باز وکیل چک میکنن.
I don't know, Sen Marty, if you know how much capacity the ASRC has to do follow-up appointments or check previous applications and make sure that there is consistent information across the applications.
Yeah, that's right. So the ASRC Clinic is available. There are free legal resources there to assist you to finalise and lodge the application. They sort of rely upon the forms having been drafted beforehand. So you're going to have to get somebody to draft them and fill them in beforehand. And it's operating on the assumption that the forms have been checked against, previously provided information. So there just isn't the capacity. It's only running for the next, I think, 6 weeks or 2 months or so. It's not going to be forever. So there isn't kind of capacity to obtain people's records from agents or lawyers or from the Department of Immigration and cross-check everything perfectly. It's a very emergency measure. But if you can have a go at drafting the forms, even if incompletely, and I mean, hopefully you would know enough about the family composition that you'd be able to fill out kind of the basic biodata, the family details. They can assist with filling out the questions that have to do with the claims. So have to do with people's particular stories, their reason for leaving Afghanistan if they've left, what they face if they're still in Afghanistan. They can prepare those during the 3 hours. So that's an option.
دیگه میگم بله میگم این ریسورس سنتر مهاجرین که هست میگه خصوصا میگه تا 6 هفته تا 2 ماه آینده همین خدمات دارن منتها او از مشتریان خود تقاضا میکنن که شما با یک کس دیگه که کمک با فرما آشنایی داشته باشه فرما را پیش از پیش خانه‌پوری کنین بخصوص در قسمت مثلا معلومات شخصی خویشاوندان مثلا نام و آدرس و تاریخ تولد گپاش کلش پیش از پیش خانه‌پوری کنین با مدارک که مثلا شاید قبلا داشته باشین سر بتین که صحیح باشه باز زمانی که میایین پیش وکیل که 3 ساعت بر شما وقت میده باز وکیل میتونه سوالای مهم از امو درخواست همراه شما یک جای بنویسن مثلا سوالای مهم که مثلا چرا جان نفر در کشور در خطره چرا پس رفتن نمیتونه اون مسائل سوالای مهم میتونه وکیل بهتون باز کردن کمک کنه.
Okay, another question that was asked was whether if you lodged your form 842, is there any way to amend it if you realize that you missed out on certain information or haven't provided all of the information? Is there a way to update or amend that?
دیگه سوال دیگه است میگه کسایی که مثلا فرم 842 را تحویل دادن و بعدا متوجه میشن که بعض معلومات را باید تغییر بدن یا کدام اشتباهی کردن آیا میتونن که این کار انجام بدن یا نه؟
There is a special notice of incorrect answer that you can submit to the department. I think it's a 1023-1023, and it asks what's the information that you gave and what should it have been.
بله میگه قسمت میگشن در برنامه نوتیس 1023 میگنش که دو به حساب نفر میرسنه که جواب فلان سوال باید این شکل می بود و ما این قسم نوشته کردیم که بتونن اصلاح کنن.
I just have one more follow-up question about the signature. If someone doesn't have access to a computer and they're illiterate and have no signature, is there any alternative? Is there possibility of signing the form if they're called in for an interview or something like that? Or is it a validity requirement?
سوال کردن در قسمت امضای برقی قبلا کردن گفتن که اگر مثلا کسی دسترسی بعد سامانات کامپیوتری ندارن و امضای برقی نمیتونن بکنن میتونن که وجود به حساب خالی بگذارن باز پسند کدام وقت در مصاحبه رفتن باز امضا بکنن.
It is a declaration and does need to be signed. We are affixing electronic signatures. San Marti, I think we get them scanned or even photographed and we just crop them and stick them in the signature section of the form electronically. So all the information can be obtained through the phone and completed through the phone. And as long as we're certain that the person is instructing us and giving us the information and they understand what they're signing, an electronic signature should be possible technically. I don't know.
دیگه اومد میگه امضای برقی میگه ضرور است که باید امضا باشه چون یک اظهارنامه رو امضا میکنن و اونجا به حساب تصدیق میکنه که ما چیزایی گفتیم راست گفتیم. میگه همه چیزا از طریق تلفن میتونن انجام بدن سوال جواب بکنن از طریق تلفن سوالا رو بکنن باز میتونن به حساب امضای خود سر چیز امضا کنن و او رو اسکن کنن یا عکسش بگیرن بازو برای وکیل بفرستن یا اینجا بفرستن بازو عکسش بگیرن کراپ کنن و در جای امضا او رو بندازن یا کپی کنن.
Tanishka, I don't have any questions emailed to me, but there's lots of questions in the chat. Do you want me to go through them? Or,
yeah, I can go through some of the chat ones.
Yep.
So there was one question about, is there any priority depending on where the family is based, for example, Iran or Pakistan?
Not that
دیگه
we're
سوال
aware.
دیگه کردن گفتن آیا کدام اولیت میتن برای در قسمت بوده باشه که در کجا او درخواست است یا در ایران یا پاکستان کدام اولیت چیز داره یا چطور؟
Not that we're aware of in terms of priority cohorts. The way this program works is really quite opaque. It's not very clear what the makeup will be across the refugee intake.
تا جایی که ما اطلاع داریم میگه کدام اولیت خاص ندارن که از کجا اولیت میتونن برش دیگه و غیر از اون همین روان که بسیار روان واضح نیست ما صحیح نمیفهمیم که از کدام قسمت درخواست‌ها رو زودتر میگیرن.
I suppose maybe one thing to also emphasize something that I heard last week from somebody at the Asrc Clinic is that they understood that their family would have a better chance or would receive a higher level of priority for their humanitarian visa application if they remained in Kabul. I have to say that is not the case. It's unclear to us whether there are going to be any more evacuations happening from Kabul. It's certainly not the case that there is still, visa processing happening apace, that people are being, airlifted out of Kabul with, any great speed. So rather than people endangering themselves by remaining in Kabul thinking that they'll receive priority for that reason, they should try and make arrangements that would guarantee their safety during what will probably be a very long visa processing time.
بعض مردم ها میگه آوازه بوده که گفتن کسایی در کابل باقی مانند بر از اولیت میتن و شاید مثلا پرواز برای عاجل نه بگیره و بیاره منتها میگه که این گپ میگه صحت نداره خود ما اوایل که مثلا پروازا بود بله از کابل اول مردم میکشیدن منتها حال کدام اولیت خاص نداره و از اینکه مثلا نفر جانش بیشتر در خطر بفته در کابل باقی بانه بهتر است که مثلا جای دیگه بره وقتی پروسه یا روند ویزا که هست بسیار طولانی است.
Okay, I think this might be the last question because I know Samantha wants to do a wrap up. And this is one of the common ones that we get from a lot of people who lodge the applications. How long will it take to get an acknowledgement letter from the government?
خب یک سوال دیگه است که میگه زیاد مردم اینو میپرسن میگه چی مدت زمان در بر میگیره تا که یک جواب از دولت برشون بیاید که بله ما درخواست شما رو گرفتیم و بررسی میکنیم.
Aaron, you're muted.
Sure how long acknowledgements are taking. The visa process could take a year, even during the Syrian crisis, where a lot of people were in imminent danger. The additional places that were promised took well over 6 months.
بله
and
میگه
close to a year.
تا که بسا بوده تصدیق کنن که ما گرفتیم میگه شاید یک سال در بر بگیره حتی زمانی که بسیار حالتهای اضطراری در سوریه بوده که با وجود بسیار اضطراری بود اقلا میگه 6 ماه وقت در بر گرفت.
So maybe I'll add to that just to give you an indication of the applications that we lodged in a real hurry. So around this time a month ago, just to get them in before 31st of August, we haven't received acknowledgements in relation to those applications that we made validly using the online system. There was no difficulty with them at all. And we understand that that's exactly the same for all lawyers who've been lodging these applications. So immigration is, how can you say, like hoarding the applications and will presumably issue hundreds of acknowledgements all at once. So it's not unusual to wait up to a month.
حتی مثلا ما مثلا فرض مال برای مثلا میگه ما با وجودی که بعض درخواست‌ها را بسیار به شکل عاجل میگه تحویل دادیم پیش 31 آگوست باید تسلیم میکردیم تا به حال برای ما هیچ بساب جواب نامده که ما درخواست شما را گرفتیم دیگه من شاید دولت میگه کلش نگاه کنن باید دفعه نامه روان کنه که برای ما درخواستتون گرفتیم اما معلوم نیست.
Samantha, did you have a final wrap-up slide?
I did, but Saeed's hand is raised.
Yeah, sorry. Just that CSP, you mentioned you can apply from any third country. Is that any third country, or there are some countries that we can't sponsor from?
Actually, that's kind of a question better directed at Danushki. We actually don't know, and I don't know whether Danushki can say which countries are a priority.
Yeah, so there are some priority countries. So what we advise people who are wanting to see if they're eligible is to call us, and we have a team of people who are trained to kind of go through each person's circumstances and assess their eligibility and let them know. So we'll do that on a case-by-case basis. So feel free to call the AIMS number, and we can definitely assist you on an individual basis with that. Mohammed, if you want to translate that.
دیگه اونجا بسا سوال کنم میگه برنامه CSP کی بودن، میگه چطور میشه که از کدام کشورها بسا اولیت میتن فکر میکنم. باز خانم گفت که میتونه شما دفتر ایمیس زنگ بزنید و ما بسا باز نظر و سوالایی که شما پرسان میکنیم با میتونیم بهتون بگیم که کی شرایطش داره کی شرایطش نداره.
And I did see a few more questions about CSV. So we do on our website have frequently asked questions that we've addressed. Anything that's not addressed there, we will kind of seek to update that section and provide some more clarity.
همچنین شما در صفحه اینترنت ما برین، میگه ما زیاد میگه سوالایی که قبلا پرسان شده درباره برنامه CSP ما جوابش رو داشته کردیم. اون رو شما مطالعه کنین، اگه مثلا جوابایت نیافتین میتونید با ما به تماس شوین.
And just one last question, sorry. Somebody has messaged me, said they've been granted the 499 subclass visa in Afghanistan, but they couldn't get to the airport. What do they do now?
That's a
سوال دیگه است. کسایی که نوشته کردن برای ما که ویزه مثلا سبکلاس 499 رو دریافت کردن منتها در کابل بند ماندن و نه از کدام طریق بیاین.
That's a really good question. I've heard from a lot of people who hold those visas. They were granted in a hurry leading up to the 31st of August, and then there were just no more evacuation flights. You might remember, and we will make our slides available. You might remember in one of my slides, there were 3 emails for the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. They remained the contacts for people who have received temporary safe haven visas or temporary humanitarian concern visas. Email those email addresses and ask for instructions on what you're supposed to do. I heard from somebody a few weeks ago that DFAT was going to make arrangements to, once the borders with Pakistan were open, to then facilitate people to travel to the airports there and receive their visa grant, because usually what you get is not in fact the visa grant. You get a notice that if you attend the airport, the visa grant will be finalized. They're very complicated, these visas. Anyway, the long story short is keep in touch with those Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade email addresses that I provided, and they will give you further instructions, because there are many people in that position I know stuck in Kabul.
دیگه من میگه بر من سوالای زیاد در قسمت همی آمده که زیاد مردم ها در کابل عمل بند ماندن و این ویزای 492 که ویزای موقت پناهندگی از گرفتن و فعلا بند ماندن. دیگه میگه شاید که مثلا بعداً مثلا وزارت خارجه استرالیا یک راه را درست کنه که این آدما بتونن سفر کنن برن مثلا فرض مال پاکستان، از پاکستان بتونن پرواز بکنن. بسیار میگه ویزه تریکی است، بهتره که ویزا را دارن کدوم ویزه اصلی نیست، در میدان هوایی که میرن باز اونجا برشان ویزا را بسا تصدیق میکنن. دیگه در اسلاید قبلی که میگه بود یک 3 دانه ایمیل آدرس بوده که ایمیل آدرس وزارت خارجه استرالیا است، دیفت است. بهتر است که با اونا با تماس شین که اونا براتون معلومات دقیق‌تر بدن.
Over to you, I think, Samati. Mohammed, I know we only have you till 7:15, so I understand if you have to go.
Not right.
Excellent. Okay, just give me 1 second. I'll just share my screen again. Hang on a second. Can everyone see that okay?
Yeah.
Great. Okay. Look, I thought I'd just give everyone a few take-home points from the session tonight. The first is that everyone who is in Afghanistan, everyone who has fled Afghanistan clearly deserves a visa to be resettled in one country or another. The government being what it is, they've only promised 3,000 places for the time being, out of a program that is only, I think, 3,700 places per year. That is a very small number of places compared with the number of people who are going to be applying for places. So be aware of that. And the second connected point is if the people who are stuck overseas are immediate family members of Australians, so partner, spouse, fiance, children, parents, or orphan relatives, get some legal advice and consider other options. So, I mean, obviously you can come to us, but, you know, we can provide a list to Tanushki and Saeed after this of other lawyers who might be available to provide this type of follow-up advice. And we would hope for, you know, a reasonable cost. So the next lesson is if you are going to go ahead and lodge these applications on behalf of friends or family members overseas, then make sure that the information that you put in these applications is consistent with information that's been put on behalf of friends or family members who are here in Australia, and be very mindful not to endanger just the level of the Department of Immigration's, you know, data comparison is, you'd be stunned. So photographs get compared, fingerprints get compared, addresses get matched together, surnames get matched together. It's very complex. And lastly, seek legal advice. So as Karen has mentioned, the Asylum Seeker Resource Centre, or the ASRC, are offering for the next, I think, 6 weeks to 2 months, free legal clinics. By all means, book into those. I think Refugee Legal is also offering some limited assistance. So please be sure to get legal advice so that the legal community knows that people need advice in relation to these applications. They can't do them on their own. So even if you start drafting them, be sure to get legal advice before you lodge them. Another important, and so that's ASRC's number there. Another very important thing is, so that you call the ASRC or Refugee Legal, it looks like they're not going to offer you an appointment for a really long time. You decide to go and pay somebody. That's fair enough. Please make sure that they are qualified to prepare these applications, and please make sure that you're not having money taken from you by a person who's not qualified. And make sure that you keep copies of everything that they provide on your behalf, right? Anybody that you go and see who gives you migration assistance, other than lawyers, of course. So if you go to a migration agent, you get their name and you enter it into the government's website, and which I've put there, and they will tell you whether that person is registered to give that type of advice. Of course, as I said, not lawyers. Lawyers are not required to be registered anymore, but agents are, of course. So just check whether they're qualified. Please don't be paying thousands of dollars to people who are going to run away with your money or create problems for you in the future. So I hope that all makes sense, and we'll make our slides available, and we will also make a list of specialist lawyers available if you would like some follow-up advice after tonight.
Samantha, if I could just ask you maybe one follow-up, what would be like a reasonable fee approximation, just so that people are aware of like what will potentially be an exorbitant fee?
Yeah, look, I saw this fee of 4,500. Somebody mentioned that just to complete the forms. That seems to me to be extreme, and that seems to me to be well outside of the ballpark. So to give you an idea, and I don't want to speak out of turn, you know, Karen might be better placed to answer this question, but the legal community was talking about coming together and fixing fees at around, you know, $3,000 to prepare and lodge these applications. And that's, just to give you an idea, that's accredited specialist lawyers were coming to that type of arrangement. So if you've got somebody who's kind of, you know, working out of their own garage and wanting to charge you $4,500 to fill the forms, maybe run away. That's a little bit too much.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much, Karen and Samantha, so much for giving your time today. What we'll do is, yes, we'll compile all the presentations and the list of specialist lawyers and send it out to everyone who attended today. And we'll also try to make this recording available. And thank you, Saeed and Mohammed, as well, for assisting.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good day. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Have a good day.